Hello and welcome to the Undercut Podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Billington, and joining me this week to review all the feeder series action from Spa is the very good and close friend of the podcast, Jacob Phillips. How are you?
I am doing amazingly well, and what a fantastic weekend of feeder series action it was. I think I enjoyed pretty much all the action there was, and thanks for having me on the podcast, Jesse.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I caught bits and pieces of it. I was watching on a VPN while out in Croatia, so I saw bits and pieces of it while I was on holiday, but there were certainly some bits that you can fill me in on. So we'll dive into what the hell has happened, and one of the bigger pieces of news was Joshua Mason stepping up to Formula 2 from round 11 at Spa-Francorchamps, replacing Brad Benavides at PHM Racing by Charouz, which is a race team that always sounds like a fashion brand. But yeah, we've got a new driver joining the Formula 2 grid, and the team confirmed that the Briton will be making his F2 debut, having competed in the Euro Formula Open Championship this season, scoring 1 win and 2 podiums in the 2 rounds he's raced at. So how did he do overall this weekend? Now he's jumped into F2.
It's not the easy track to come by. Probably I'd say debut in those conditions was no easy task. So credit for him for he didn't retire from any of the race, if I remember correctly, but at the same time he didn't exactly cover himself in glory either. Now, is that a fault of his own, or was he promoted too early? Is another question potentially you could ask. I have looked at his record, and he's come off the back of, I think it was a win in the second place, as you might have mentioned, in Hungary. But his results elsewhere in other formulas didn't fill me with great confidence. But I don't want to knock him this early on in his F2 career. But it certainly looks like there was a lot of work for him and the team to help him with, so he could perform slightly better going forward. Um, it does beg the question to me. I don't want to be too critical, like I said, but is he just another pay driver? And the team do have a history of such. Obviously, Benavides is a pay driver, and he's left for, I think, potentially budgetary reasons. And Roy Nassani is, one of the kings of the pay driving world. So it is one question that certainly springs to mind. But Spa's not the easiest track to master, and if he's staying for the season, which at the moment in time I can't remember off the top of my head, if he is, he can only improve, I think, going forward.
Yeah, I think having pay drivers sort of popping up, they pop up all the time, and it'll be an interesting one to see as they go forward. Interesting career. I haven't seen if I can find the news. Here we go. Bum, 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 bum. 21-year-old Britain. Dum, bum, bum, bum. Yeah, he's just a sort of replacement for the rest of the season, it sounds like. So he could be around for a few more rounds to come. Obviously, Formula 2 has not got much left to run. We've got Zandvoort, Monza, and then straight to Abu Dhabi for them, isn't it? So he's got 3 rounds after this to sort of prove why he's there, and obviously spend his dollar wisely on an F2 car. So we'll wait and see what happens with that one. Equally, another new driver to arrive in the feeder series paddock is Formula 3's Francesco Simonazzi. Joined Carlin this weekend, and what was the reputation there? What do we think of that one?
On paper, not the best results, 14th to 24th, but you've got to remember it's his first race, and you've got to remember that it's a bigger field than F2. Obviously, 30 cars in that field. He's come to Spa, like I said, with Josh Mason, probably the hardest track that he'll go to this season, and there's only one more race to go to. But Spa is no easy place to start. And to finish both races is, I'd say, promising. It's very easy. We saw with the first sprint race, for example, in F3, very chaotic, very messy. A lot of cars dropped out there. We saw cars drop out all over the field in both races. So to stay on the track, 14th is, halfway up the field. It's not the worst result in the world. So I think that he can come away pleased from this weekend. He doesn't come into it with the best track record, but we'll certainly see what he can do going forward. And I'd say that I'd mark it down as a decent weekend, or certainly a promising one at best, or at worst even.
Yeah, not too shabby. And again, like we said, it's a challenging circuit. It was challenging conditions across the weekend as well, with sort of wet and dry changing as well. It produces quite a greasy circuit to get hold of. But nonetheless, it was mastered by a few, and we saw F2's pole position claimed by Ollie Behrman and F3's pole position claimed by Pepe Marti. Some decent qualifying sessions out there, and a lot of pressure over in F3 because there was very much the chance for one of the drivers to wrap up the season this weekend, though they did fail to do so.
They failed to do so, but at the same time, they've pretty much wrapped it up as well. I think Bortoleto needs 1 point in Monza, his home race, which I think will definitely happen. He can do it as early as the Friday in qualifying. Obviously, get 2 points in feeder series for a pole position. Yeah, it was a very astute performance. I think he did what he needed to do. Obviously, he benefited from a few other retirements in round as well, and he sort of made the bet because again, a lot of people did. So I think it's just a matter of time. Other performances from this weekend that really caught my eye. Look at Kyle Collette, who I would say up to this point has had a little bit of a disappointing season, considering it's his third season at this level. He's got a spattering of wins throughout that time, but this season was sort of looking for that starting point, and he got first place in the heavily, like I said, disrupted sprint race, but also came through on the soft tires, which eventually was the right strategy on Sunday, but also wasn't for, let's say, 80% of the race. So he was the leading one of that sort of half of the field as well. So that was also quite promising from him. So there was a lot of good performances, a few bad ones, and Bortoleto, as we sort of thought, could have wrapped it up here, but all he needed to do was make a couple of overtakes on the last lap in the feature race on Sunday. He didn't do so. He didn't take the risk, and obviously he goes to Monza with an absolutely fantastic and almost inevitable chance, really, that he's going to wrap up the championship.
Almost rather more metered in Bortoleto's case, just to go, you know what, I'll walk away with the points I've got here rather than gambling for a few more and possibly losing all of them. So it's a smarter play from him in that regard, to say the least. I think we can't really talk about Formula 3 without mentioning Sophia Flörsch as well. First woman to score points in Formula 3, I believe I'm correct in saying. Scored P7, wasn't it, at the feature
Well,
race?
I'd say she very aptly scored points in Austria, but obviously the technical difficulties there meant that she didn't. So her first official points in F3 and the first woman to score points in F3. You are correct on that. Although we have seen other women score points in GP2 as well. I think Tatiana Calderon potentially,
Mm.
and I can't remember the other one. Apologies for that, but it's the first time as the rebranded FIA Formula 3. It's certainly been a long time coming. I think she's had some decent performances in a car that, like we say, hasn't performed as well. She made the strategy work. It was obviously very tough conditions up there. Obviously, like I said many times, a very tough circuit to master. And you've got to think, going back to the Josh Mason point, obviously part of the same team, albeit at a lower formula. Why didn't they not just promote someone from an F3 team? Why did they go for Josh Mason? But if Josh Mason doesn't perform, these teams can chop and change. These contracts aren't concrete. Maybe we could see someone like Flörsch potentially moving up to F2 as well. But that's a story for another day, I guess. But on the, that's the best I've seen Flörsch all season. It's a result that I know that she is capable of, and I think it was finally good to get that result on paper.
I think we've definitely seen her not necessarily develop through the season, but certainly refine how she races through the season, and definitely gotten her feet back under the table when it comes to single seaters and a lot more accomplished with this series. So I think as her confidence builds, we'll see a few more points achieving positions through the rest of the year, and maybe that move up to F2, certainly. Speaking of F2, of course, we've already mentioned pole position claimed by Behrman, sprint race win for Fittipaldi, the first win for Baby Shark in Formula 2. He's obviously had a few
Don't sing it.
problems with his name, but yeah, it was fantastic to see him on the podium, and the emotion was there. It was great to see his brother Enzo, his brother Pietro there as well. Just superb stuff and really well earned as well. It was a proper drive and a really good overtake on, I want to say Porsche, wasn't it, to get pole
Sure.
one for that sprint race.
It
Then
was just quickly on that. So yeah, absolutely fantastic to see Fittipaldi up there. Obviously, he has the name, the history, the backing as well. It's been a long time coming for him. I think he's been close on several occasions, hasn't managed to sort of get that final step on the podium. Obviously, it was a double podium weekend, which is no easy feat in F2. It doesn't always happen, and it's certainly a sign of a good driver when it does. So I was very pleased for him. I'm a massive fan of the Brazilian anthem. It's certainly one of the more uplifting ones. Hearing that ring round Spa is absolutely magical. So yeah, I was very, very pleased for that and him.
And then, of course, you mentioned it was a double podium weekend for him because, of course, he was stood on the podium at the feature race next to Jack Doohan, who offered around the shoeies after a win there in the feature. And a pretty good win for Doohan as well. Not one that came easily. He did have to fight for it, make some passes, but in the end, it was a fairly chaotic race. I think all the junior series races across Spa weekend were quite chaotic in their own rights, but Doom came out on top. And again, he's sort of rebuilt a season that didn't start off as strongly as we'd anticipated, especially after a good end to 2022.
I was very disappointed up until about, I think it was about the mid-season stage, sort of around Silverstone. Before that, he was one of my favourites for the championship, and he could still win the championship. That is something that he could still do. I don't think he will. He's a bit too far behind, but as we've seen with F2 time and time again, these things can flip on its head. It's a crazy championship. We're going to Zandvoort and Monza, which will throw up some surprises, some weather potentially as well. Who knows? And who doesn't love a shoey? I've never personally done one. It's something that's on my bucket list. I don't know if you've ever tried a shoey, Jesse, but it certainly looked like the guys on the podium didn't exactly enjoy it either. But I'm not sure he will care in the slightest because, as I've said, he is further towards that top of the table.
I was going to say the juice of the foot is not something I've had the pleasure of trying, but there we go. Yeah, just another sort of crackers F2 feature race, and one of those things that sort of really certifies your love for the feeder series and the junior rungs of motorsport, because they're just that little bit more exciting. There's just that bit of action always going on the circuit, even if it is Roy Nassani attempting murder on another driver. But hey,
You roll with those kind of things. If you've heard my voice on the podcast before, which some of you may have done, you will know that I'm a massive F3 lover, and I'm an F1, F3, sorry, mega fan. Just as Jesse's a massive fan of Yuki Tsunoda. I've actually preferred F2 this year over F3. I think that F3 has been slightly messy. Obviously, it's been completely. It's still been very enjoyable. We've had the obviously chaotic races that we usually do, but we saw an F3 race, Jesse. I'm not sure if you caught it on the Saturday, which only had two racing laps, and it was very much akin to what we saw in Australia. We're going to tracks that are very hard to master. Obviously, F3 have been to Spa before. We've seen some great races there. It just seems that I don't know if it's a problem with the field this year. Maybe we haven't got as many talents as we usually have, but we saw only two racing laps, and which meant that the FIA decided there were no points handed out. Although they went back on that decision and then decided that points were handed out. And yes, it's Spa. We've got to assume that these things will happen, but it wasn't the greatest look for F3.
yeah, a bit messy. I'd definitely say that I much like you have enjoyed Formula 2 over Formula 3 this season. It's been a more polished championship. It's felt a bit more, not necessarily adult, but it's had the chaotic energy to it while also putting together the results and sort of giving drivers a real opportunity to grow and develop more so than just simply chucking 30 cars at a field and going, there you go, racing. It's been, it's felt a more sort of polished product for certain.
Yeah, I think it's been and I don't know if it was circuit specific. I think we've still seen some good drives, but yeah, F2 for me has been the better of the series this year. Um, Going off of that, what do we think of the rest of the action there in F2? Who do you think's now the favourite for the championship? Obviously, we've seen Vesti lose his lead. Porsche is, I think, 11 points clear now. We said at the start of the year, I remember you using the term, you might have even coined it, Jesse, Formula Porsche. We haven't exactly seen that this year, although he's still in the lead of a championship, and now he's there. He has a consistency. He knows how to win races and finish things off. Will we see him finish that championship off, or will we see Vesti or maybe even a Wassa or Doohan come through and take these sports come Abu Dhabi?
It's going to be an interesting one to try and call. I really had an anticipation that we were going to have Formula Porsche this season. I really thought that after so many years in the series, with I don't want to say no competition coming against him, but certainly nowhere near as sort of strong competition as he faced last year, maybe with um, Aston Martin's reserve driver, name escapes my brain. I said
Djokovic.
Drogovic, that's the one. I think it's yeah, he's got a he thought he might be able to walk this season, and I thought he might be able to as well, but it seems that he hasn't. And I still think he'll be able to win this season. I think that's where I'd still possibly put a few pounds of a bet, but I'm not overly confident in it. It's F2, it could swing anyway at any point in time still.
I wouldn't. I think I'd put a fiver on it, but no more. I think it's still very much in the balance. But he has the know-how, he has the longevity in the championship to know how to get things done. Although, like we said, it wouldn't be. I thought he might have not necessarily had it wrapped up by now because there's still 3 rounds to go. But we would go into sort of Monza and Zandvoort after the summer break, knowing that he's probably or likely to have one hand on the trophy, which is definitely not the case.
Mm. It'll be interesting to see how this next round develops, I think, as the pressure mounts and knowing that he's got two drivers breathing down his neck for that challenge, especially if Iwasa's had the potential of a Red Bull or Alpha Tauri drive waved in front of him, it might spur him on a little bit. And especially if Vesti obviously has this Mexico FP1 test lined up, it might sort of rekindle a bit of interest in sort of what his next step is, especially if Mercedes are going, we might not be able to get you into the Mercedes, but rumor is there's a Williams seat coming up or something. And I think there's certainly going to be some heat amongst the top three to be certain. And maybe with Doohan now moving ahead of Martins in the standings, that will really also put the pressure on from behind. So we'll wait and see what happens in that regard.
We will wait and see what happens. I'm still gonna. You know, I like the sound of Vesti winning that championship. I think that I've certainly got behind him this year. I've sort of followed him since his F3 days in 2020. He was quite close to winning a championship there as well. He's got the Mercedes backing. I think he seems like an all-round nice guy, and I'd like to see him do it. But I think maybe because we all came into the season thinking that Porsche would dominate it, and that was always in my mindset that he would win it. I think it'd be nice if we had had a. I don't want to call it upset because it's maybe harsh on the other drivers, but it was always earmarked as Porsche season. And it'd be nice to see him not win it, but it depends. Will that cover his chances of F1? That remains to be seen. Obviously, with Zhou and Bottas potentially sticking around, or we'll have to see what happens there. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens, and I can't put my finger on it just yet. I'm not going to call it either way.
It very much followed the usual pattern of F2. If we sort of earmarked it as Porsche season, it goes anyway, but we'll have to wait and see. Drivers for you that stood out from across the weekend, because I think my viewing was a bit patchy. I feel it's a bit unfair on me to try and commentate on them, but for you, who were the drivers in Formula 2 and Formula 3 that really stood off the cards for you?
Formula 2, I'm going to go with, first of all, fantastic win for Fittipaldi. His first win in Formula 2, like we've said. He brought a really good, feel good feel to the weekend. Obviously, like I mentioned, the Brazilian anthem. He's really shown what he can do. And it actually reminded me this weekend, I completely forgot this over the course of the weekend and the season, that he's part of the Red Bull Driver Academy. Now, we know how potentially treacherous that can be, how much it can lead to a seat, and then false promises come along and you don't get the seat. But it's going to be drivers like that that might put him in the shop window. I think there are people like Iwasa, for example, and Lawson before him who are very much ahead in the queue, but those sort of drives can't harm his cause. And potentially there's always the, like we said before on our, if you go over and listen to our F1 review podcast for the Belgian Grand Prix, we've talked about potentially drives in FP1 and FP2 sessions throughout the rest of the season. And Alpha Tower will need a seat filling there at some point as well for one of those sessions, and maybe we see Fittipaldi get a drive there. So who knows? But he was certainly one that impressed me, and I've got to go with the other winner this weekend. I'm going to say very boring this weekend, but it was a victory that he needed to happen. It's a victory that we didn't necessarily expect from him over the course of the season, based on how the first sort of 5 or 6 months has gone. Is Jack Doohan? He's really put himself where he should be, very much in that championship fight. So that was one for me that solidifies his place in the top 4 or 5.
Very nice. Then when it comes to Formula 3, the names that stood out from the scorecards there.
Formula 3, who did I go for? I went for Flörsch, first of all, her first points, like we've said. I think it was obviously a very good feel good story for the first woman to score points in F3. It was a hard track to master, like I've said. The conditions didn't help, and it was also good to see driver and team coming together to make a very brave call on what was, it was very touch and go at the start of that race. We were told it was a wet track. We couldn't see all the track on the world feed, so I wasn't sure how wet it was, but it was certainly wet enough for the wet tires. We saw the performance come through. So it took a combination of, obviously Sophia would have had some input in that, I'm sure, saying, you know what, let's try and brave it on the tires. She stuck to her gun, she made it work, and she came home with what is a very, very good result, P7. It's a big field, like we say. It's not 20 cars. It doesn't go without saying. It is forgotten quite a lot of the time. There are 30 cars in that field. She has finished in the top 33% of that. So and above that as well. Top 7 is very good result for her. I can't go past Taylor Barnard as well. A win for Genza, like we said. they don't really often win in F3. So it was very good to see a different team up there. That was the theme of that race. We saw so many teams up there that don't normally fulfill part of that upper echelons of the grid.
Mm.
And who did I pick as my third driver? This is why I should
Colette.
have my notes up. Who did I have? I had Colette. There I go, Colette. So I've chosen two winners, and Flörsch, who really impressed me. Colette, like I said, won the first race, although he didn't have to do much because, like we said, it was majority one behind the safety car, or run behind the safety car, should I say. But he made the alternate strategy work in the feature race, which is for me one of the most difficult things I saw done this weekend. It was treacherous. It certainly wasn't the optimal strategy for the first 80%, 85% of that race, but he got the tyres in a working window whereby he started to make gains on Flörsch, for example, on Montoya, and those drivers ahead in that sort of wet tyre running train, where other drivers weren't making those gains and falling back from the likes of Flörsch. So he was one of the only drivers to make that work. I think it showed maturity, which he should be showing. Let's not escape that fact. He's been in the series 3 years, and I think it was a very well-rounded weekend for him, and a weekend that I think he needed as well.
Very much so. It's certainly a packed weekend. The net result of it, though, when it comes to driver and constructor championships for both series, in Formula 2, the drivers are Porsche leads from Vesti and Iwasa. And when it comes to constructors there, it is ART leading Prema and then Carlin. In Formula 3, it's Bortoletto leading Aaron and Marti. And when it comes to constructors in Formula 3, it is Prema leading Trident and Campos. And that is very much all we have time for in a very condensed feeder series episode. We'll be back, obviously, after the summer break. We have F1 content for you. We'll probably have some other bits and pieces scattered across the summer break to keep you all entertained. So make sure you've liked, subscribed, and got notifications turned on to not miss anything. And if you want even more in the meantime, Jacob, where can the people find you?
Well, if you're lucky enough, you might find me down a local pub situated somewhere around the country or abroad. Or if you can't find me down the pub because it either is closed or I've been kicked out, you'll find me on Twitter at JacobPhil18.
Fantastic. And obviously, you can find the rest of the team on the Undercut podcast. We're on Instagram, Twitter. We've obviously got our Spotify and YouTube channel, as well as a TikTok. There's some footage there from Ellie May when she attended Formula E in London over the weekend. And if you want more from me, then you can find me as at Jesse on Cars on Twitter and Instagram. And you can also pick up the latest issue of Classic Car Weekly, which I can assure you I'm probably in somewhere. I do write for it. It's like my job outside of this. So please buy a copy. Otherwise, we'll be back after the summer break as Formula One and its associated cabal of feeder series moves to Zandvoort.